Why not? All right. Welcome to our continuing session. We want to ask at the end, and I'll ask you if you want to ponder on any of this now. If you have suggestions, feedback, encouragement, critiques, alternatives we might consider for the whole course. We're near the middle of the midterm exam, but we are trying out a number of new things, different days, and if we have things that we could do more of or less of, we have time to change and welcome your feedback. So either you can say something orally, which we'd welcome, and or we have a way of communicating, sending us emails or whatever, and then office hours. All of these are most welcome now and on a continuing basis. Okay. We have really 3 sections in the course that are on the syllabus for the 2 sessions, Monday and Wednesday. And there's one thing we want to do which will link us a little bit to the earlier section, which we didn't get to, which is to give a little bit of word. Let me back up and say, what we have featured really now in this general section is bottom up and top down as sources of innovation, sources of cultural placemaking. And we've seen some combinations of these, as in Sister Potato, in the sense that the Chinese national government was concerned about potatoes, but then it was the individual Sister Potato herself who wrote the song. So that's a sort of interesting combination. Some things, by contrast, are very much do it yourself as a theme here, and do it yourself builds on more generally creativity, self-starting in multiple ways, and certainly one of the most visible recent examples. Let's just start off with Manhattan and Jane Jacobs. Alan, do you want to just show what we have? No more introduction.
Okay. Should we start from the beginning or show some specific?
Yeah, I think it's I can't remember if we have a. Let's see how long it is. It's
26 minutes.
Oh no, okay. Well, yeah. Let's just do a few minutes at the beginning. That's
okay.
Fine. Let's find something else. Yeah.
Hundreds of miles of parkways and expressways, and dozens of bridges and tunnels, now connected the city to the suburban reaches of Long Island and beyond. Hundreds more had been driven through the outer boroughs themselves, weaving together, as Moses himself declared, the loose strands and frayed edges of the metropolitan arterial tapestry. But in all the frenzy of construction, the master builder had never been able to penetrate the heart of Manhattan itself with a superhighway. And in 1961, he resolved to do something about it, fixing in his sights a low-lying area of Lower Manhattan, stretching from Chinatown in the south, up through the wayward lanes and ancient side streets of Greenwich Village.
We simply repeat that cities are created by and for traffic. A city without traffic is a ghost town. The area between Canal Street and 3rd Street, a strip 3/4 of a mile wide, is the most depressed area in Lower Manhattan, and one of the worst, if not the worst, slums in the entire city. Robert Moses.
Condemning the West Village as a slum, and the old cast iron district to the south as an obstacle to the free flow of traffic. By 1961, he had set in motion two immense federal initiatives. A vast urban renewal project that would level 14 entire blocks along Hudson Street in the Village. And an 8-lane elevated highway, one of his most cherished dreams, that would drive straight across the heart of Lower Manhattan, from the East River to the Hudson, destroying thousands of historic structures and displacing nearly 10,000 residents and workers.
It's difficult to even make anyone understand what would have happened. He would have bulldozed a swath about 225 feet wide right across Lower Manhattan. Today, that's the cast iron district of Soho. What was the vision? What was the aims of a man who would decide, for the sake of the automobile, to cut a swath across a city, across a beautiful, vibrant, bustling part of the city? And you know, Robert Moses wanted to build 3 expressways across New York City, not just the Lower Manhattan. He had a Mid-Manhattan expressway, which would have run across 30th Street in the air. And he wanted to build one again at ground level at 125th Street, an Upper Manhattan expressway.
For decades, nothing had stopped the juggernaut of road building or slowed the rampage of urban renewal, which, in the name of rebuilding the city, had torn the heart out of one community after another. But this time things would turn out differently. Determined to save Manhattan from the devastation that had blighted the Bronx, residents of the Village banded together and resolved to fight, selecting as their leader a 45-year-old journalist and working mother from Hudson Street, who had that very year published a groundbreaking book about the mistakes of urban planning. Her name was Jane Jacobs. The book was called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and New York would never be the same again.
And it started out by saying something like, this is an attack on city planning. And then she went through the litany of what Le Corbusier and other ideologues had imagined what a city should be as opposed to what a city really was.
Jane Jacobs was taking on the orthodoxies of planning that had prevailed in the post-World War II period, the ideas of Le Corbusier and the Bauhaus and other planners who thought that the city needed to be renewed. There were areas that needed help, but the kind of help that she saw that they needed was the assistance to allow people to continue living in their brownstones, in the neighborhoods where they had a harmony with their neighbors. And the destruction of those neighborhoods is one of the great tragedies of post-World War II New York.
She understood that urban economies are different. She understood the sort of beehive, 1,000 different interdependent functions nature of urban economies. And that's what we lose when we surrender the street to the automobile. When people don't want to be on the street anymore, when they reshape their lives in a way that they're always in privatized space rather than sharing public space, Jane Jacobs knew 35 years ago that that was a recipe for the destruction of what makes cities wonderful.
Look what they have built. Low-income projects that become worse centers of delinquency and vandalism than the slums they were supposed to replace. Promenades that go from no place to nowhere and have no promenaders. Expressways that eviscerate great cities. This is not the rebuilding of cities. This is the sacking of cities. Jane Jacobs.
She hit the nerve at the right moment with that book. It was the right book at exactly the right moment because she made people see particulars. She made them see the street. This had been a period of urban renewal when everything was on a model, on a big plan or a drawing with overlays. And she made people look at the street and what was there. She spoke about the eyes on the street, the smaller buildings where people looked out and watched their neighbors. She spoke about the small stores, the mom and pop stores, all the things that urban renewal not only was destroying, but didn't acknowledge existed.
She basically said that from her house at 555 Hudson Street in the West Village, from the sidewalk of her block, you could observe what a whole city was like. But it returned the discussion of what urbanism should be about, what New York should be about, from big land plan games to individuals, shops, streets, cars, crosswalks, networks of people, people rich and poor living more closely together, less concerned with the elevator to the 35th floor and more concerned with the life of the 5-story walk-up.
Under the seeming disorder of the old city, wherever the old city is working successfully, is a marvelous order for maintaining the safety of the streets and the freedom of the city. It is a complex order. Its essence is the intricacy of sidewalk use, bringing with it a constant succession of eyes. This order is composed of movement and change, and we may liken it to the dance, not to a simple-minded precision dance, but to an intricate ballet in which the individual dancers and ensembles all have distinctive parts which miraculously reinforce each other and compose an orderly whole. Jane Jacobs.
Her writing enabled people to imagine her block, but also enabled people to see other blocks. She created, maybe without intending to do it, a kind of empathy, and opened up possibilities for empathy as a political force in the 60s. So that once people could imagine how other people lived, even if they didn't concretely know, they could help them, they could work for them, they could work together.
When she comes out with her book in 1961, it's not just that it's brilliantly written, it's pithy, it's punchy, it's down to earth, it's enjoyable, it's entertaining, it's mind capturing.
So Professor, should we stop here or continue?
Wait, that's fine. This is great. You can get more everywhere. Everybody read her. She had a huge impact, and you get this is perfect, just as is. So the related, let's pause just for maybe a minute or two if anyone has a question, quick comment, and then we can go on to more. Anything on what we saw? Any reactions? Okay. We're playing practical in a couple of these presentations right now. Let's go right to the handbook. This is written for you. If you are an individual citizen in Chicago, how could you change the block and area that you're concerned with? Here's some things from this handbook. Let's go a little more slowly, maybe Alan, right back at the beginning, please. Yeah. Okay. So here's the book. It's on Canvas. It's a PDF, 40-50 pages, mostly pictures. Let's just look at some of the pages that I have flagged there, please. So here you get the overview, but what you see in the pictures is, in a sense, it's an application of Jane Jacobs. I mean, what do you do? That is not just fight against the freeway, which is what she did and many people are still doing, but what do you do positively? What do you do when you've got something like this? So what this does very nicely is say, what can you see in this picture, in this one scene, this one place? And here are examples. Just read a couple of these things. Take a stroll with your family. You can watch the boats. You can bird watch. You can people watch. You can take on the Chicago skyline. Mayor Daley I once said, the essence of a city is all of these things going on simultaneously. And that's what makes it so interesting, that you can see 20 different things happening at the same time. And that makes us different people because we can feel them and see them, and makes life more interesting. Okay, so looking more at specifics here, let's scroll down. They have a power of 10. All right. Yeah, scroll on to, okay, here we go. Let's look at this a little bit. Take an example, a city, think of 10 major destinations in the Chicago area. Navy Pier, Ravinia, Frank Lloyd Wright, St. Patrick's Day Parade, Lake Michigan, Lakefront Path, etc. Then a destination which has 10 plus places. Ice rink. No, yeah, back up just a little more slowly. Then once you get down to one place, example here, Daly Plaza, downtown Chicago, what might you do? You could go to the farmer's market, you could sit on the Picasso statue, you could meet up for Chicago's critical mass ride. This is a ride which began in San Francisco and has now continued in some 100 plus cities, maybe more than that now, but it used to be people who would ride around blocking or stopping traffic for several hours, and Mayor Daley too would ride with them. He didn't, as most of the mayors in New York and San Francisco fought them. They said, these are bohemians, they're trying to destroy our city. Not at all. They're making people think, how can we make the city more interesting for everybody, as well as critique what we see? So you see, again, the multiple things that you can do as an individual. Then let's scroll down, please. Okay, many answers that are already there in specific regions. That is not just where you live on your block, but if you go to different parts of this city, here are some things you could do in different places that have very different neighborhood styles. So you can don your lederhosen for 2 annual German fests, etc. Let's scroll on. Okay, but look at this. Not only how can we do it, but what makes it more interesting, more compelling, more dramatic? The numbers, the types of social networks, the land use patterns, but more specifically, so we have here measurements, intangibles, and then key attributes. Think of these not as, this is not a fancy theory, it's more of a checklist, but there's still things that have been distilled from looking at lots of things that work nicely. And it's obviously, this is not social science, this is written for average folks, but it's very practically and thoughtfully done. Let's scroll on. Okay, so each of these points is then elaborated a little bit. Sociability, comfort and image, uses, and etc. So there's a little bit about all of these things that at least make you think about them. Do we have this here on my block or not? How could we change it, etc. Let's scroll on down. You're just going slowly. These are all good points. Okay, then here's some dramatic examples where they go into just in brief case studies. And let's look at the 2 or 3 I think I had as their very nice contrasts. Okay, let's look at this one. Look at the 3rd paragraph. Emboldened by these new connections, Young, this is Adele Young, a 58-year-old grandmother living in a West Side neighborhood of Austin, about 98% African American. Emboldened by these new connections, she took a simple yet brave step. They stood on the street corner and offered bowls of chili to drug dealers. We let them know that we were not only concerned about our safety, but about them. We prayed for them and offered them food. There was no confrontation. We just hung around them, and sometimes we would pray. We showed them love and attention, and after a while, they left our block. End of quote. Powerful stuff. How often do you hear that said or featured in the American mass media? You see the opposite. Okay, this is what we can do if we think about it a little more deeply. This same idea has been used in many other cities and neighborhoods all over Chicago. Some of the most dangerous areas. People show up, they say, you know, we think we're going to have a little grilling here today. And so they bring out a grill and they start grilling. They offer the food to the drug dealers, and the drug dealers say, what are you doing here? This is not, you know, and so they may have some kind of questioning, but this has dramatically changed many areas. Crime has dropped by over half in the last 20 years in almost all of the American cities for many complicated reasons. But this is one micro reason, one micro dynamic, which can change and did change one block very dramatically. Okay. Is it surveillance? Well, it's not the kind of surveillance where you have a collar around your ankle with a sensor going to the police. That's a very dramatic, visible negative. This is different. Okay, let's scroll. But eyes on the street. Jane, remember that one. Remember those 4 words. Jane Jacobs, eyes on the street. That's a key which can be adapted in many ways like this. Did we have another one here? Lincoln Square. Okay, the 63rd Drum Circle. This is nearby and dramatic as well. No, sorry, not Elmhurst. Where's the 63rd Street?
Yeah, that's 32nd page. Maybe this one. No, not this one. Go up a little bit.
It went a little bit too fast.
Yeah, this one.
Here we go. Yeah, this is just south of Hyde Park, right on the lakefront. I go biking by this all the time. This guy has been part of the circle since 1983. This has been around a long time, but there is no organization. The drummers have been meeting here daily for the last 40 years. The circle is 63rd Street because the nearby communities, South Shore, Hyde Park, and Kenwood, said Marcus Lenton, a construction manager, has been coming to listen for 30 years and has many friends in the circle. The drummers don't play in a formalized amphitheater. There's no need to reserve the space. They're anywhere. You can dance, you can listen, you can eat, you can drink, whatever. Come alone or come with friends. Okay. Maybe scroll on down. I think this is the main points. But these are, okay, yes.
2 cases, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, let's look at these, look at these steps. Okay, just look at the checklist as we slowly scroll through these, please.
Mm-hmm.
This is the general list, then we'll look at the specifics. Assessing the 10 most important places in your neighborhood. Think more concretely about your neighborhood and how these may work. So it's step 1, assessing the challenges. Step 2, select a site. Let me just add here, you see here, you see this line 3, Chicago's Department of Planning and Development, or your alderman's office. I just have looked up the new commissioners of planning and development in the city of Chicago and the commissioner on cultural affairs. Take a look at those 2 people. And you can see some things very close to this kind of thinking: safe, fun, charming, welcoming, how to make the city of Chicago, all over the city, especially those places that are the furthest from this right now, become closer, not identical, in no way homogeneous, building on the local specifics, but making them accessible, charming, welcoming. Okay, next, please. Key stakeholders. Who's potentially important? Friends and neighbors, stores, non-government organizations, local community groups, streets and sanitation ward office. That is, lots of people are willing and ready and happy to help. If you have a good idea, go and talk to them. And I've done this many times. I've done it over the weekend, etc., on something new. I'll scroll on down. Collect data, get some background, something that will work. Let me pause for 1 second. There's a story I read today about the famous Johns Hopkins group that is publishing all the data on COVID-19. Does anybody know who the people are and who started it? I just read about it. I thought it was part of the Johns Hopkins. You know, Johns Hopkins is maybe one of the top hospitals and medical schools in the United States and the world. The website has nothing to do with the Johns Hopkins Medical School. It was started by an associate professor woman in engineering and a Chinese PhD student. The two of them put it together, and he built a website in 1 day, and they started looking for information on COVID-19 and posting it. And they continued. That's all it is. I couldn't believe it. Has nothing to do with fancy medical research. She has no background specifically on COVID-19 or whatever. Think of how you can change, and it's now used all over the world. They had something like 1 billion people downloading from their website in the last week. So you can start with yours block, but you can think globally if you get the right topic at the right time as well. Okay, observation techniques. So scraping data is one way. I mean, they're scraping from websites all over the world for getting COVID-19 deaths and mortality and this kind of prevention, that kind of treatment, et cetera, as these things are changing very fast. We have lots of ignorance as well as very fast learning. Okay, step 5 is conduct place evaluations. Try to get some feedback from people who are there. What's working? How can we get a little more input from people who actually participate and think about it? Step 6, translating these ideas into action with the working group. Work with some people. Get some ideas, get feedback, and listen to everybody who's participating. Develop a visual concept plan. Okay. Create a summary report and presentation. Implement short-term actions. Start with something doable, easy, quick. Develop long-term design and management plans. Maybe some measures if possible. If some are very hard to measure, other things are easy. Assess results and replicate. Where else might this be done if it's working well? Okay. This is near the end. Anything else here?
No, just
no. Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
All right. So it's nothing really fancy, but it's useful. It's concrete, and we all can learn from it. All right. Look over here too. All right. Any questions, comments on anything there? Does any one of you want to mention an example of something you may ever have done a little bit like that? Okay. Well, if you want to post something on Canvas, you're welcome to do so. We'll be looking for more things like this. And even if you've never done this, maybe you will more than once in the future. The next item, Alan, if you want to get ready, we could almost show it. I'll just introduce briefly Gordon Douglas. He grew up in Los Angeles. He went to college at the University of Southern California, which is mostly, I won't say mostly, but which is best known as a film school. It's in Film City, Los Angeles, and a number of movie stars, directors, producers. I mean, if you're a top person and if you're the daughter of a film star and you want to go into the movies, you might go to University of Southern California. So he was surrounded with people who were locals, but who thought ambitiously. And he then came here to Chicago, and he was a PhD student at sociology department, and he managed to, we connected somehow. He was a student, and then he was a teaching assistant with me for two or three sessions. And I learned from him, he learned from me. It was great. And he then got to his own thesis topic, which was do-it-yourself urban design. And so what you saw there briefly was a paper in a lead sociology journal called City and Community. But his homepage and video on the book project is the main thing which we can look at now. And you can see him, this is a social science version, if you will, for sociologists. And then in a sense, it's a distilled but original version of Jane Jacobs. But Jane Jacobs is known for stopping things. What this does is to stress what can be done. So here's a Highland Park booth. It's a free book exchange created out of an abandoned payphone by two people. It wasn't done by the city government. It wasn't done by a bookstore. It was done by two average citizens. And this is just put up, and you can give books, you can give other people your old books, you can read them, you can then put them back when you finish, etc. No zoning, probably no permit. That's the interesting part, that okay, a man waiting at a bus stop. All right, let's not just look at these pictures. Let's let him talk, because he talks about it better than we can do. But this is the background linking to some of this, to the materials we're reading in the course. This is his website. I think, isn't there a link here? Yeah.
The video should be somewhere in here.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I checked the video myself, a couple of weeks ago it should be right there. I can't quite remember where though. Maybe there's just a plus sign to click in the middle of.
Yeah, this one?
Here we go.
Yeah,
that's
sure.
it.
Sure.
That's it.
Hi, I'm Gordon Douglas from the University of Chicago, author of a new study called Do-It-Yourself Urban Design, the social practice of informal improvement through unauthorized alteration, published in City and Community. I'm standing on Hoyt Street in Brooklyn's Boerum Hill neighborhood. The homemade sign behind me is a perfect example of the sort of entirely unauthorized and yet explicitly functional and civic-minded interventions that I call DIY urban design. Now, there are numerous ways in which people make illegal or unauthorized alterations to urban space, from graffiti and street art to large-scale political occupations. And my research actually started out looking at many of these. But I began to feel that the emphasis on vandalism and disorder on the one hand, or radical critical resistance on the other, was missing out on something else. The efforts of those who see something in need of improving in their communities and choose to do it themselves without asking permission. I wanted to know what motivates these people to effectively do urban planning and design work themselves. Who has the resources and the privilege to do this? And in what context do these efforts appear to be happening? I talked with dozens of do-it-yourself or DIY urban designers in cities in the US, Canada, and beyond.
Astoria Scum River Bridge was a collaboration with Poster Child, who's a street artist from Toronto, in which we built a 7-foot footbridge to solve a problem where there was a leaky pipe from an Amtrak bridge, and it was flooding a sidewalk for over 2 decades. So we built a footbridge to span this leak that it sometimes can cover 100 square feet of the sidewalk.
For example, in the East Hollywood neighborhood, there's a tunnel that goes under the 101 for pedestrians. And this tunnel is also a great shortcut for cyclists. But the end of it, there are parked cars, and there's no curb cut. So we'd watch people get off their bikes and have to navigate through these parked cars. So what we did is we just spray painted outside the tunnel red. And then we got some cement and some broken cinder blocks, and we cemented a little ramp so that older people and kids who couldn't hop the curb could just ride off the curb. It would have taken a vast amount of time and money for us to get the city to make those changes. You know, we're saving the city money and time by just doing it ourselves.
Or take Matt Tomasulo, a Raleigh, North Carolina resident who wanted his city to be more welcoming and pedestrian-friendly for the people who live there, but was frustrated by officials and other powerful interests focused on large development schemes rather than everyday citizens.
I researched how to go about getting permission to hang signs in Raleigh, and it was going to take 6 to 8 months to get permission and $1,200 worth of liability insurance. So I just decided to install cheap, light, and quick signs around the city depicting how many minutes by foot it was to different destinations. And it took about an hour overnight.
In speaking to these do-it-yourselfers, I found widespread frustration with the bureaucracy of city planning processes. And while some said they still ultimately hoped the city would step up and make needed improvements, many shared a feeling that the city does not or simply cannot do it right anyway, feeling that it is better when the people do it.
The Department of DIY couldn't work on a large scale. The whole point is that it's small scale, and the changes that we've made in the environment are very small, but they're ones that we can make because we have an intimate understanding of the space that we exist in.
Of course, across all of these motivations, justifications, and goals, the decision to make DIY improvements also implies a strong sense of self-confidence and entitlement. This raises important questions about the possibility of overreaching and potentially unintended consequences of these ostensibly altruistic interventions. Among other things, though there are plenty of exceptions, I find that DIY urban design actions are more common in newly hip or gentrifying neighborhoods than in the resource-poor inner city areas or rundown industrial districts where DIY action should ostensibly be most needed. And what with the favorable attention that these sorts of creative activities often receive, it is entirely possible that, just like official urban design improvements, they could ultimately contribute to uneven growth, development, and cultural and demographic displacement. But either way, DIY urban design is happening in our cities and can have wide-ranging implications for local communities and broader urban policy.
I think that people doing unauthorized shit in public space is rapid prototyping for how we'll actually use public space, and that there's something really important about transgressing in public space against social mores or even against laws that actually do provide a blueprint for how we actually will interact with that space.
Okay. Can we quit? These are maybe just more than by chance, perhaps, taken from the US and big cities. Let me just talk a little bit more generally about what we've read globally as how much is this specific to the West? For some, it's an outgrowth of classic Western individualism. For cities, the core of Balzac and Baudelaire's and Benjamin's bohemianism and the flaneur in Paris, Joseph Schumpeter's creative destruction driving the economy, and Jane Jacobs, of course, as we saw. If it is one, if not the main theme today celebrated among younger economists to explain economic growth of cities and nations, their work is on patents as one major focus of how cities and the economy works better in some cities, in some regions, in some countries. But is it just big macro stuff like that? The makeover in home decoration, hairstyle, dressing, and more basic personality for everyone, including African American women, are centrally featured in Oprah Winfrey's TV shows, her magazine, and her book club. But the arts, creativity, and innovation is not uniquely Western. The architecture, sculptures, wall paintings, and temples from the Incas, the ancient Indians in Asian India, and the Chinese were world leaders centuries before the West was doing anything. Smaller countries have often survived by creative ideas. The ancient Greeks and Israelis, the Asian tigers in more recent, late 20th century years. Who were the Asian tigers? Let me ask that. Who can say, what are the 4 Asian tigers?
Taiwan, Japan, maybe not Japan, Korea, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore.
Singapore. But if we cite these cases, there are dangers of spuriousness and self-selective migration. Who could suggest how the 4 Asian tigers illustrate the problems of spuriousness and self-selective migration? These are big things that you need to think about in every aspect of social life, not just, but they're central to remember. Anybody want to suggest? That is, one idea is that these people were somehow different, they worked harder, they were small, maybe it's small size. Is it small size that makes a difference? Is it, who can suggest, with the video we saw, they said suggest 10 factors. Who can suggest a few factors that might have made these 4 tigers more dynamic? There's no right or wrong answer, but well, there may be some wrong answers, but there are many right answers, but think about them. But if we think about size, about competition, background history, think as well, how much may we have found that there were people in mainland China who were unhappy with where they were, what they were doing, and they became what is termed by Max Weber when he wrote his book about 1900 on China. He called them the overseas Chinese. These were people in Africa, in Asian India, in the Philippines, in Indonesia. And it may be that these were like the Mexicans and many other immigrants who've come here from other countries. They brought more ambition, more talent, willingness to leave where they're comfortable. And there may be a little bit of self-selection. And this part as well of the related to this is the controversial book called The Tiger Mom. This is by the woman who's the Chinese ethnically of the woman of Chinese ethnic background who grew up in the Philippines, went to Harvard, Yale Law School, or I've forgotten which law school, but she's now teaching at Yale Law School, and she's written these very small, challenging, controversial books. And she had two daughters. I think I've mentioned this, but just briefly, she had two daughters. This is the main point of the book. That the first daughter she raised like her mother in the way she was raised herself. Very tough. You know, you've got to be first in your class, work harder, et cetera, et cetera. And it worked for the first daughter. For the second daughter, it was a total disaster. And the second daughter revolted against her mother, and it didn't work. So basically the book says, I'm not sure how you should raise your daughter. But this in turn has engendered a lot of discussion about so-called progressive education, which is the laboratory school at the University of Chicago is one of the major world centers of progressive education from the time of John Dewey, around 1900 or so. Okay, if we cite these cases, so I'm mentioning that. Consider then two again, more recent examples, very recently. Beijing, we organized two conferences in 2018 and 2015. Of the 100 or so organizers, officials, people involved with cultural innovation, they were from all over China, some from maybe, I don't know how many, maybe a third from Beijing, 2/3 from the rest of China. The audience mostly listened in 2015. There was not very much discussion, challenging, no DIY. 3 short years later, one Beijing organizer discussed how he created cultural activities to bring together persons from rural areas who were living in Beijing. He was hugely successful. He got people together, they would have tea, they would go on outings together, they planted gardens, they would dance, I mean, all sorts of things. The first question was, how did you get the money to start this? And what was his reply? If he were in Chicago, what would you have asked him? Would you have asked him, how did you get the money to start? Many Americans, many Chicagoans might ask that, but especially in Beijing, perhaps I was not expecting his answer. What was his answer? Anybody want to guess?
Foreign investment from abroad, like from the Western countries.
Good possible idea. It might have been right, but that's not what he said. Anybody else want to make another guess? His actual answer was, if you want to be innovative, you can never wait for money. You have to do it on your own. Do it yourself. He didn't use the words DIY, but he gave the same answer as Jane Jacobs and Gordon Douglas. Do it on your own, and when it's working, the money will come. And I've said the same thing for years, as to students, to people who are assistant professors saying, you know, I'd like to do a big study. How can I do it? I say, start something small on your own, show people how to do it. And that's exactly what Gordon Douglas did. And you could see this is not just writing a book, this is doing these little projects, these DIY projects. You know, fixing a leaky pipe, or not, they don't fix the pipe necessarily, but they'll put a little bridge around it, which they can do in a few hours. But it was a couple of years before anyone did it. Okay, if this sort of artistic and cultural self-expressive perspective is more important for consumption in the arts, it may be less important than in the past for mass production of standardized commodities like televisions or toasters. So people in Korea may have thought about themselves in the past as making televisions or toasters, which people in the West want, but as the production export economy, which has dominated the style and been the secret of success, not a secret, it's very openly discussed for decades, for Japan initially, then for Korea, for China, for Taiwan. They made lots of success in doing this, but today, as these countries like the US and the West are becoming more and more consumption domestically driven, you've got to make things that a Chinese citizen wants to buy for use for him or herself inside China. This is a dramatic shift which is implied. And whether you're in China or in Taiwan or in Illinois or Massachusetts, most of the people in the US business schools, in the US even in public policy schools, talk to you about production, capital investment, money, advertising, selling to the market, as if they're not people. And so we have new concepts that we need, like consumer taste, opinion leaders, style, magazines related to these, social media, Instagram photos. Creativity takes on new importance as it's bottom up just as much as top down. It's not as if you don't need any money, but the money goes where the people want it to go, as well as where someone thinks it's a good idea. How did I mentioned, I think, cafes in Hee-Sung Jong's study. Cafes, how many cafes were there in Seoul about 10 or 15 years ago? Maybe 300. How many are there today in Seoul? 18,000. Where did they come from? Starbucks. So the cafe originated in Rome and Paris and London coffee shops. There were, Americans would say in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, we don't have cafes, we're not a cafe society, implying only lazy people go to cafes. So Americans explicitly refused to have cafes. Then along came Starbucks, and look at what changed. So the Starbucks Corporation went to Seoul and they talked to their counterparts. They said, you know, we think big, we know how to do this. So they talked to the big Samsung company that makes toasters and cars and computer chips, competes with Apple, and said, you know, why don't we have some Starbucks cafes and we'll help you do them in Seoul. And Samsung said, fine, yeah, let's build it. We'll build a section of our Seoul corporation, and we'll open cafes in Seoul. There are more Starbucks cafes today in Seoul than any other city in the world. But if you look at the total number of cafes, Starbucks are less than 5%. Over 95% of the cafes are not big corporate cafes. They're do-it-yourself. People in Seoul saw that they worked, and then they went out and started cat cafes, sheep cafes, environmental greening cafes. They can combine with bookstores. You can combine them with music. You can combine them with dancing, with all kinds of things. And all of these are found increasingly around the world. But my point of these examples from outside the West is that DIY is not something which is just in Paris, even though it may have started in a more dramatic, visible manner in the case of Balzac. Balzac, in a sense, wrote some of the first book. He talked about the flaneur. He talked about the need to have a neighborhood where we can foster this. But the point is, it's now so widespread that you don't need to have just one way to do it. It's happening in many, many ways in much more eclectic manner. And if you look, as you know, from personal experience at the social media, there are all kinds of social media activities which are both supporting as well as it's at the beginning, they may be challenging, attacking, or critiquing, maybe not specifically the government in general, but saying, why don't we have a drain? Can you fix the drain in front of my house? And people may send that to a government agency, which may or may not act. But the fact is, the social media can be a help in improving service delivery. And in some governments, in some places, and I would say China may be, I don't have systematic data to show this, but my sense casually is that the Chinese are doing better and a more thorough job. They have far more staff workers looking online. So if Gordon Douglas had lived in China and started online, maybe he would have done less DIY himself. I don't know. Nevertheless, there's plenty of room for starting out in different ways. But the point is, these variously fit together. And what we've talked about in the earlier sections of the course in this way connect with Jane Jacobs, the DIY activities, and the like. Any questions, comments on any of this? I've tried in these brief comments to show the global implications, the global examples, and the ways that these multiple pieces fit together and fit with the readings in the whole first half of the course. But we're now today especially, but also in several later sections, we go back up and down from more general theorizing data issues like the COVID-19 website at Johns Hopkins, as well as to very specific things that one person can do on their own. So we're doing more policy-oriented things now, and we have more room for student discussion. We've got some great ideas that some of you are already working on, and we're reserving for the last few weeks of the course. But that is for general presentation. But if you've got an idea for something, it doesn't have to be a big project. It could be something you could do in an hour, or something you might do with someone else. Sort of extending something like this, think about it and feel free to share, to send us an email, chat on website, and we'd love to explore anything like this with you. But questions, comments from anyone? Eden.
Hi, yeah, my question is DIY in this sense just being defined as something that's like not overseen by like the government or whatever? Like when I was talking about the coffee shops in Korea, is it like if it's non-Samsung, non-Starbucks affiliated, it's considered DIY? Like what's the definition of DIY, or is that term being used liberally?
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that out. Probably I should not have said DIY and applied it for Starbucks. You were right. That is, you're paying more attention to the logic of the readings than I am. The DIY term, at least as invented, and I think it was invented at least in the title of the book, certainly enhanced by Gordon Douglas, is without the government. That is, as people were putting up the signs without asking anybody. They didn't get anybody's permission. They just went ahead and did it. A cafe is different. I mean, if you're going to open a cafe, generally you've got to apply for zoning. You've got to get a construction permit. You've got to follow regulations, or you'll simply go to jail in most cities. So DIY is different in that sense. And generally these are small enough things that probably the people won't go to jail, although some might. So whether or not and how much you want to move in a more political direction like that is a different issue. And we have in here, mixed in with some of these other readings, is a paper we've worked on off and on for 3.5 years with college students here, usually political science students, who want to say, how do we have different people doing various kinds of new politics, either against or in favor of Donald Trump. That is, Trump was such a revolution and that within the US, and he's still breaking lots of rules week by week by week, that lots of people are still asking, you know, what are the political implications of doing this or that and so forth. So I'm not at all trying to say we should not talk about politics, but we're trying to do so thoughtfully and analytically, and looking at 1, 2, 3 sides of an issue, and how the different participants react. So just one more example. For about 3 years in a row, I used in all my classes Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Black Lives Matter, and the ISIS group in the Middle East, the Muslim build a new state kind of. And so we each big idea we went through each week, we would say, now how would each of these 4 conceive of and build on and use these? So in that sense, I was explicitly bringing in the ideological and political implications of everything. I'm doing that less. Maybe I'm used to the answers, but I'm comfortable and happy to do that with any of these at any point, for any one of these as you like. Such as, I was shocked to read, I think it's maybe even listed briefly on the syllabus, that the ISIS group that was so active in being super violent and being a terrorist organization actively used poetry in celebrating their activities and in recruiting new members if you read Arabic. But on their English language websites, they never use poetry. And the leader of the whole ISIS group was married to a poet. Okay. Follow-up from you, Eden, or anyone else? Okay. Black Lives Matter, I will also mention, was clearly a background force that was used in our very first section by Theaster Gates in his 9 Principles of Equitable Redevelopment. He adapted elements and style from Black Lives Matter, as well as the LGBTQ activities, as well as our 15 scenes dimensions, and he put them together in his own artistic way. But he had a dancer, a poetess, someone else performing to illustrate each of the 9 principles of equitable redevelopment in an artistic, musical, theatrical manner, much better than I could ever have imagined. So the videos which had that, unfortunately, have been taken down. I wanted to show them to you, but I hesitate to show them if he took them down, but they were there. Okay. And there's new stuff on him all the time. He's got a ton of fascinating videos of challenging all kinds of people. Other comments or questions? I've told you before more than once that Madison, just 1 second, that I'm a resident of Bronzeville, and I've been busy this weekend and the last week. We're getting more active. And so working with lower income African Americans is part of what I've been doing for my whole adult life. When I've lived basically here my whole adult life, since I came to the University of Chicago. And that has given me more of a sense of the diversity, the multiplicity, the complexity of the many different perspectives, the many different projects that people would like to do or don't like or want to do in different ways, and that there's no one right way, but there's a whole lot of DIY stuff going on in Bronzeville all the time. So even though it may be that they don't have quite the style that Gordon Douglas talked about, you don't need to live in Hyde Park to do, or Greenwich Village to do this. You can do it anywhere. I'm not mentioning just Bronzeville. I'm mentioning as well China, Japan, and the rest of the world. Okay. Was it Gordon? I'm sorry. Yeah, Madison Pearson, please.
Hi. So I remember you talking about Tiger Mom and.
Is it easy to turn on your video or is it?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Okay. Okay.
I remember you discussing Tiger Mom and global local politics and discussing basically like the links to creativity and individualism. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that and potentially ties to DIY and kind of the community ideal of, you know, the idea of like changing the environment around you potentially.
Yeah, I mean, these are tricky, controversial issues, and clearly there's no right or wrong. I'm not an expert on raising Asian children, but she had lots of points which were that is, some of them were what she wrote in the book, but what I also was summarizing were some of the big visible public debates which occurred when the book first came out. Two of them were with the president of Harvard at the time, who was a very smart economist, and he had been one of the two, I think he was the, forgotten his title, but he was one of the top two people who went to Asia at the time of what was called then the Asian fiscal crisis, when there was a collapse of Japan and China. And that is, China did not collapse by any means, but there was a serious series of financial problems, and so he basically, so I'm mentioning him as one person. The second was David Brooks. David Brooks is a USC college graduate, studied history here, never got more than a BA. But he's been an editorial writer for the New York Times, and he writes maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks in the New York Times. He's published maybe 5 or 6 books. The most famous was on Bobo's. Bobo's in Paradise was the first, where he takes the bohemian ideas of Balzac and Baudelaire, and then he joins them with bourgeois. So beau means bourgeois, but it also means bohemian. So the French think this is a French concept, but in fact it was invented in New York by New York Times, so in his 2 books. So, but Bobo's clearly are the simple idea of our goth girl with her black dress and her white makeup, talking about Baudelaire, who made enough money on her website to not be just a poor person begging for funds. So Bobo's, in that sense, to simplify, have enough resources that they can implement their bohemian lifestyle with some money to do so. So he fills in, and that, in a sense, he's his very concept of Bobo is like DIY, but what do you do if you've got a little bit more money to do so as an individual? Okay, so starting from that background, what David Brooks has done is become a commentator and critic of all kinds of governments, especially US domestic politics. But also, he's written books on religion, he's written books on attacking rationality that we're using in science and scientific theories. We stress rationality too much. We don't pay enough attention to emotion. He has a whole book that elaborates that, and it's a very thoughtful. I mean, to have the, you know, he has a BA in history. He never studied graduate school social science. He's taken on and says, you know, the fundamental rationality idea of you social scientists is misplaced. And so clearly he's got a lot of confidence, but he's got lots of interesting ideas. All right, so he has he has a daughter who was in high school roughly the time that the book came out, on Tiger Mom, and he was worried about his daughter not being, who's thoughtful, probably German Jewish in background, New Yorkers. I mean, so pretty, highly cultivated background. He's worried that his daughter was going to be strongly superseded by these Tiger Moms. And this, I'll just briefly mention, has happened. That is, some people have some people, and Brooks even said, yes, you can identify the Bobo type with as being perhaps a little more Jewish than others. He didn't call it Jews, but part of it can be linked in that way. But if you look at the entrance classes, and I just happened by chance, I was in Harvard Square 5-6 years ago, about 3 days before the normal arrival time for arriving students was to occur. And what I saw were hundreds, if not hundreds, maybe thousands of Asian families bringing their Asian kids from China, from Taiwan, from wherever, to Harvard Square. That's a change. Okay, so David Brooks raised the bigger, I'd say the big theme which these two commentators raised, which is one of the first which many Americans will raise to the Tiger Mom idea, is the ideal of something like progressive education. That is, let me preface that by saying, Americans don't raise their kids in any one way. There are hundreds of different styles of raising children, and people argue over what's right or wrong. But one of them, by many sort of highly educated people, is called progressive education, and featured here at the Lab School. And the basic idea is let the child do whatever the child wants. If a child doesn't want to study, let them get bad grades. That's the total opposite of the Tiger Mom. And so, or let them do reasonably, but don't push them too hard, or don't help them with, should you help the child with homework? Some Asian parents and some American parents really do the whole homework with the child, maybe with the parent leading, so that the homework gets straight A's, but does the child really have solving the problem in the child's head or not? That's a hard gray question. And so the bigger point, which I would say both of them made, was if you are really forcing a particular style of education or child rearing totally of do it my way, you are not permitting the building of creative thinking and creativity more generally, as much as if you are more permissive. The most recent extreme example that I've heard about is in Denmark, where they have less than 1 hour, or maybe, and often no homework at all. The kids just come to school, and the school day is much shorter than in the US. And then it was a TV program, I think, or a video, and the interviewers went around and they asked the kids, do you like school? And every one of them, at least that were interviewed, said, oh, I love it, and I want to stay here longer. How often do you hear that in the US or in France or China? Okay, so that in a sense, or if you join that with the idea that what you learn in this class and to get a BA, you're going to forget. The facts and names and dates and places you're going to forget. If you're like me, you'll forget it in a week or two. For you, you may remember it for 2 or 3 or 10 years. But if you learn more generally how to be creative and how to learn new things and teach yourself new things, you can ideally remain creative and active throughout your entire life. And that's what I would say the USC generally is trying to do, to help you think and be creative. And that's, in a sense, we have more of an ethos that stresses that here than do the Ivy League schools. And I went to a little Ivy League school myself, Bowdoin, and the Ivy League schools stress much more how you dress, how you dance, how you drink, how you sing, and those may or may not be useful or good, but we don't stress them very much. The fraternities are a small footnote to the University of Chicago social life, in contrast to the football and fraternity dominant styles of the so-called Big Ten, or at least many of the basic, many American universities. So this place generally is an illustration of a very distinctive culture, in contrast to at least the traditional Ivy League and to the Big Ten and to many other places. And as I think I mentioned very briefly, the newest numbers for next year from the admissions show that we're right there, right next to Harvard and Stanford, and ahead of Princeton and Yale, which was not the case at all 10 years ago. We were about the same as Princeton and Yale. We're now ahead of them, etc. So other questions or comments?
I mean, this goes back to the Harvard thing, but I don't know if any of you have been following the lawsuit was unfolding there several years ago, but this like intersects a lot with like affirmative action. So there was this group that was arguing that Asian Americans were being discriminated against in college admissions because they had like numerically the highest scores, but continued to like constitute a minority of like the elite of elite schools like Harvard. And there were these interesting debates where they were trying to figure out if like Asian students were being scored lower on like in certain like interpersonal or like character personality qualities on these like admissions interviews. And I feel like a lot of this plays into these ideas, like we think about stereotypes of like associations of like East Asians with mathematics, or these kinds of things that we think about like creativity sometimes as being this kind of like Western phenomenon, and that it's like the people from the Far East especially are like at some kind of disadvantage with this. And it just raises like so many questions around like race and stereotyping and just like cultural values and norms more generally, and how all of these things like rather gracelessly intersect with one another.
Good point, Brandon. I'll even add in support of your point that when even Tocqueville wrote the most famous book on what is distinctive about America, called Democracy in America, Tocqueville wrote, the Americans are very good at imitating the good ideas, the good pottery, the good plates, the products that we have in Europe, and they can manufacture them here, they can send them to us, but they will never be at a level, he wrote, of creativity and innovation that we are in Europe. So think about that in terms of that conversation today, or about the labels of Asians. And I think you can tell by reading between the lines that you've heard me talk that many people may talk about Asia, including many Asians themselves may talk that way, but just wait. I've said, Europe's the past, the US is present, the Asia is the future. And we've got a lot to learn from comparing. Even if there is a past, we can all learn from one another. Other comments or questions? Okay, anything more general that anyone wants to raise? I mostly mentioned, or do any of our three TAs have any better suggestion than mine? That is, you can post a suggestion. Well, you can simply send the four of us suggestions if you want to in your own name with your own email. If you'd like to send something anonymously, is there a better way that anyone has to suggest? Or I had an option which I sent out to our TAs to review. Anybody have anything better? Is what I said okay? Okay, what I suggested, if you want to send something anonymously, use a friend's email or use your grandmother's dog's email, and in the subject heading say, "From my grandmother's dog." And we will watch for things from my grandmother's dog, and we'll know that they are anonymous comments about what Terry Clark and Brandon Swart are doing badly in the course, and you guys don't shave enough and you need more makeup if you want to tell us that, or whatever else we could do, or our jokes need to be better. Whatever you want to tell us. But if there are things which we can act on, we'd love to get suggestions now while we're in the middle of the course, and more generally to get a sense of, because we're trying, as you can see, we're trying out a lot of new things. Because this is online, we're not in person, so we're trying to find more videos and more things that are different. So it's not just me talking. But we're not having as much discussion as we sometimes do. So these were all excellent points that you've raised. But if you're comfortable not having very much student discussion with all of you here, we'll continue as we are. But we want to at least give you the opportunity to bring in discussion points either in person or in any other way that you'd find useful. So comments welcome, and based in part on what you say to us, we will review other things that we may slightly change or substantially change for the remaining weeks of the course. Anything else before we close? Anything I've forgotten from our 3 TAs? Okay, thank you, folks. And recording, I guess.